Thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. You've packed the house, which is amazing to see. And we're so thrilled tonight to welcome New York-based artist Anthony McCall here to St. Louis and to CAM. Since the 1970s, Anthony has been at the forefront of contemporary art, working across performance, cinema, and installation. His practice privileges the embodied experience, that moment of being in the room with his works of art, or if we are fortunate enough to experience them outdoors among some of the few, to commune with them actually outside in nature. His work's emphasis on perception, sensation, and duration connects them to major artistic vanguards of the 20th and 21st centuries, from structuralist filmmaking and minimalist sculpture to socially engaged art practice. In the process, Anthony has influenced artists working across these disciplines, including Olafur Eliasson, Bruce McClure, and Sandra Gibson and Louis Rakoder, who will be performing here at CAM next Friday. Anthony is perhaps best known for his solid light works that he began making in the early 1970s. Essentially, these works, which can be either horizontal or vertical, comprise slowly shifting beams of projected light that become outlined in the space of a haze-filled gallery and are further enhanced through viewer interaction. Anthony completed his first piece, the seminal Line Describing a Cone, in 1973, shortly after moving from London to New York. In this piece, as Anthony has written, the film begins as a coherent pencil of light, like a laser beam, and develops through 30 minutes into a complete hollow cone. At the time, Anthony was working exclusively in analog film, and he would often present his 16mm animations during happening-like screenings with artist friends and colleagues in downtown lofts. Back then, dust particles in the air of these often unfinished or more industrialized spaces, along with the cigarette smoke in the room, provided a sort of natural ambient haze that produced the solid light effect. Today, however, digital technology has transformed Anthony's practice, enabling him to produce works that are not only longer in duration, but are also more precise and complex. We see this development clearly in the extraordinary piece currently on view here at CAM, You and I Horizontal 2 from 2006. In this work, which I hope by now you've had the opportunity to view downstairs in the galleries, two animated lines slowly interact with each other over the course of the piece's 33-minute duration. With its shifting planes of light and marbled articulation produced by the ongoing presence of haze in the room, the piece underscores the primacy of light as both subject and object of the work, rather as a conduit or medium to some other image or narrative. Furthermore, as our current exhibition season celebrates the 10th anniversary of this marvelous building, Anthony's exhibition here beautifully illustrates how his work operates at the intersection of cinema, drawing, and sculpture, perfectly encapsulating the magic that results when these forms encounter architecture. Anthony's accomplishments are incredibly extensive, so I will name just but a few here. His work is currently on view in multiple institutions worldwide, including the exhibitions Crossing the Elbe at Dichterhallen in Hamburg, Germany, Lunch with Olympia at Yale University School of Art's Edgewood Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut, and Face to Face 2 at Galerie Martine Aboukaya in Paris. In 2 weeks from today, Anthony will present his solid light works from the 1970s at Gallery Spruth-Majors in Berlin. He has exhibited in exhibitions around the world, including at the Moderna Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Tate Britain and the Serpentine Gallery in London, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Hangar Bicocca in Milan, and most recently at the Fina Art Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, earlier this fall. He's also been included in major scholarly group exhibitions, including the highly influential show Into the Light, the Projected Image in American Art, 1964 to 1977 at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Beyond Cinema, The Art of Projection at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, The Cinema Effect, Illusion, Reality, and the Projected Image at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., Online at the Museum of Modern Art, and Ends of the Earth, Land Art to 1974 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles and Haus der Kunst in Munich. His work is represented in numerous major collections, including many of the institutions I've just mentioned. Needless to say, it is clear that his impact on contemporary art and film is both extensive and extraordinary. So Anthony will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And with that, I ask you to join me in welcoming Anthony McCall.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Lisa and Kelly, for the invitation to come tonight. Well, I'm going to jump straight in. One of the things that interested me as a very young artist was the paradox that cinema was a very strange animal, in that what you saw on the screen was elsewhere from where you were when you were watching it, from the projection, from the space of projection, and also happened in a time that was earlier than that moment you were in when you were looking. So a past and an elsewhere. And what was the question that was I was asking was there a present tense of cinema? Was there a way in which projection, something could only happen at the moment of projection, thus sharing the space with its audience and also occupying the same present tense as the audience? That film became my first solid light film. The film that answered this question for me, called The Line Describing a Cone, which, as Kelly said, it's a line of a white line that takes 30 minutes to turn into a circle. But of course, in three-dimensional space, what's occurring in what's building up is a conical form, which can be occupied by people, which can incorporate its observers. This image is from the first showing of the film I did in New York at Artist Space in 1974. So that was the beginning, and of course I found I'd stumbled into, it was a cinematic question that I'd been asking, but I'd stumbled into two different zones which I hadn't expected. One, of course, is sculpture, because the work occupies three-dimensional space and requires the observer to walk around. And the other was, in a way, performance, in that when you're walking around a piece like this with other people, the other people, in a way, become performers in your own experience. And so there's a kind of performative aspect to it. Is this microphone okay? Yeah. Okay, fine, all right. At any rate, Line Describing a Cone was a 30-minute film for an assembled audience. And one thing that struck me was that it might be more interesting to open that space of looking up, much the same way as it had already opened up for sculpture or painting, which is to have an open-ended duration, which is chosen by the visitor. And so I began to play around with the idea of extending the duration of a work and making the structure non-narrative, make it steady state, if you like, such a way that people could visit the work rather than assemble to see it. And first work I made of this kind was called Long Film for 4 Projectors. It had a minimum duration of 5.5 hours. It was intended to be visited, not watched through. You'll see the way the projectors are organized, such a way that if you go into the room, you're in the film. There's no way to be outside of it. So it's a kind of a field, if you like. And the viewer is surrounded two ways, spatially by the fact that everything is in front of you, behind you, and to the side of you, and durationally in the sense that the piece will outlive your visit to it. Here's an installation view of the same piece. Now I went further with this idea and distilled there was a principle operating with the projectors, whereby I had only 4 reels of film generated this entire piece, and I just kept replaying the same reels, but constantly changing them, so they'd go forwards, backwards, forwards, inside out, backwards, inside out, creating completely different permutations within the space. And the next work I made, 4 projected movements, distilled that idea to a single projector and a single movement of a plane of light through 90 degrees. So that's a 15-minute sweep of this plane of light into the wall or away from the wall or down onto the floor and so on. And so the architecture of the space got drawn into the experience of looking at it and to the and with the projector as a kind of agency of change. Here's the 4 movements. You see, by simply rethreading the film back through the projector and occasionally flipping the direction the reel was facing, one could create 4 different spatial movements from one single reel of film. I then went on to try making a film in which, maybe I could just make one further comment about these 2 works, which is these are the beginning of what I think we would now call installation, in that you visited something that was going on in space. However, they required, this is before the computer, and they required human projectionists to run the installation. So in a way, they were early examples of installation, but they were also, you might say now, long-duration performances, in that they required a lot of hands to make them happen. The mechanical parts had to be run by human beings. So, but it was leading in a certain direction. My next piece, long film for ambient light, is an installation, I think, in the modern sense. Actually, it was an installation in a loft. It consisted only of a single light bulb hanging on the right, a row of windows covered with white paper, and it was so the piece was a durational piece in which, if you visited it repeatedly, it would keep changing. If you came during the middle of the day, these windows were like projectors projecting light into the space, and you barely noticed the electric light. At night, they became screens, so they reflected the electric light on the inside. I won't say any more about that because it's a rather complicated piece, but I'll just show you some. We did it again in New York at the Deer Space on 22nd Street. And this is a view of the installation at dusk as the light's falling, but there's still light coming through the windows, the screens. This is at night, and this is at 12 noon the next morning. Keep track of where I am. Yes, this next slide represents 20 years passing. Over the next 20 years, I stopped, at this point I stopped making art, and I had no idea it would last 20 years, but in any way it did. And so we're going to pick up the story again in 2003. And this was my first new work, which was called Doubling Back, where I had realized that I'd only used, before that in the 70s, I'd only used circles and straight lines as my syntax, if you like. And I discovered that the traveling wave was quite an interesting form. A wave is simply a circle that keeps changing its mind, and it does so along an axis that's a straight line. So in a way, it's a hybrid of the first 2 forms. What I did in this piece was simply to have one traveling wave moving sideways through the frame and the other moving vertically, albeit extremely slowly. And what that actually produced were different forms. I've used color just so you can see the difference, but you can see that as the waves are doing just what they're doing, they're moving at an even speed. They create these pockets, and those pockets become quite interesting 3-dimensional forms, complex ones. But and the other thing I did with this piece was to put the projector on the floor in the corner of the room and project along the wall, so that the side wall and the floor become the kind of architectural steady space against which the piece unfolds. It's like a kind of an unfolding, really, takes place. Here's, in fact, some drawings showing, I mean, it's about every 3 minutes, I think, the drawing. So you can see it starts off as a closed form, it begins to unfurl in a way, it turns over on itself, and then begins to close up along the other axis, ending up very similar to where it started, but facing a different direction. And then the second part of the film is simply goes backwards to where it started. So it has a cyclical structure, which is to say an installational structure, because it goes continuously through the day. This is a view of the form and the footprint on the wall and the body in space. I've used those terms to describe the difference between the graphic image, the drawing that's being projected, which after all is generating the three-dimensional form. So I call it the footprint and the body as a way of differentiating between the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional. And I should also say at this point maybe that all my solid light films, they're many things, but one of the things they always are is a drawing. They never stop being a drawing. They are fundamentally a drawing. And here's a view in the other direction, with one's back to the footprint, looking down toward the projector. And those of you who've seen the piece downstairs will recognize what sort of a thing it is. And one of the strange things about these works, on the whole, is that you can't look at both at the same time. You either choose to look at the drawing on the wall, the footprint, or to engage the three-dimensional volumetric space by going into it, at which time you have your back to the drawing. When in the 70s, when I was, duration as an idea interested me enormously, because it was that which seemed to point the way to different ways in which an observer can observe a work of art. So, you have a short duration, then you need the audience has to assemble in order to watch it together, or they're going to miss it. You have a very long duration, then the way something is looked at completely changes. And so I was very interested philosophically in the idea of duration. When I revisited all this after my break of 20 years, I found that certain things had changed, that duration seemed to me to be far less about those things, far more about mortality. And that did rather change the way I began to think about these works and what kind of new works I might make. And I happened to look at one of the old ones, which was called Conical Solid, which consisted just of a circle on the wall, which expanded and contracted at different speeds. There were 4 different speeds, from very slow to very fast. And it had a very typical title for the time, cone of variable volume, very cold, very descriptive of what happened and nothing much else. And I looked at it, this is in the mid-90s, and looked at it and was astonished to discover something that I'd never noticed before, which is it was unmistakably a fact that this cone of light was breathing like a lung in and out. And this suddenly became a key for me to seeing how I might then make a new series based on the same idea but with a different perspective. And I realized that perhaps there was actually a possibility of representing the body with forms like this, not in any pictorial sense, obviously, but in rather more abstract ways. And thinking about what a body was, I decided that in a way, a body as a thing doesn't exist. We can only understand our own corporeal presence in relation to others. So, in other words, having a body is really to be in a state of exchange with another body. And that seemed to be the idea of 2 forms in a state of exchange, 2 different forms, seemed like quite an interesting abstract way to approach the idea of the corporeal. And I began to look for a form that would somehow handle that. Now, in cinema, it's easy to relate 2 things in one narrative. You have shot counter shot. You have parallel action, for instance. The heroine tied to the railway tracks, the hero on a white horse galloping to the rescue, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. a very familiar cinematic form. Unfortunately, in sculptural space, which is one of the spaces I seem to occupy, you can't make things disappear and bring them back. It's just incomprehensible. And so I found myself searching for some kind of way of having two forms in the same space, which would work sculpturally. And I found it in a now archaic piece of cinematic syntax called the wipe. In the 30s and 40s, it was felt that if you just did a cut from one scene to another, no one would quite understand what had happened, that it needed to be underscored in some way. And so they had this kind of soft cut called a wipe, whereby one image gradually covers up the other. So, you'd have a girl at bar drinking, then you'd have a new image would gradually cover up the man drinking. It'd be a woman driving in a car in the rain. And you would understand from that there'd been a change of scene. And I've got one example of a wipe here, which is actually from Kurosawa, from the Seven Samurai. But you'll watch for the way the cut occurs. Whoops, seem to have lost it. Let me try that again. No, don't think it's going to work. Sorry. Well, you'll have to imagine it. I'm so sorry. There was a man close up talking to us, and then saying something very dramatic, and then an image of a man striding along in long shot gradually covered it up, and thereby executing the transition. Which brings us neatly to the piece downstairs, You and I, horizontal number 2, which uses two forms. And I'm just going to draw them for you. Aha, I'm getting that. I think I'm causing that. Okay. So, in the piece downstairs, You and I, horizontal 2, is this okay, this microphone? Yeah, okay. Yeah. We have two forms. We have an ellipse. And what the ellipse does, repeatedly, but very, very slowly, is to shrink. Only along one axis, though. And then, having done that, it very slowly restores to the full volume. The other form is a straight line that over 15 minutes turns very gradually into a traveling wave. So those are our two forms. Now let's bring in our wipe. So here's our frame. And let's say we begin with the elliptical form. And the wipe starts here. The important thing about my wipe, as opposed to the ones that we were talking about in cinema, the cinematic ones would last something like half a second or 1 second. It was just a very quick tip-off as to what was going on. What I decided to do was to radically extend that to 7.5 minutes, 8 minutes, 15 minutes, giving myself a slow space in which two forms can interact. So let's say we're a minute in to the wipe. There's an invisible edge to it. It's coming just across like so. So now we're bringing in, remember we've got an ellipse and we've got a wave. So we're bringing in the beginning of the wave. We get halfway through. We've now got half a wave, half an ellipse. 3/4 of the way across. We've got much more of a wave form and very little of the ellipse. And at the end of the wipe, we've just entirely have our waveform. And so, if this animation can be made to work, I'm now going to look at that. This is actual speed. Now you can see perhaps the wipe moving in invisible edge of the wipe is here. So this is the amount of this form is increasing while that form is decreasing. But of course, at the same time, this is expanding a little bit or contracting, and that form is moving towards us. The wave is moving in this direction. So you have quite a speedy moment where they meet. A lot of changes going on, especially if you think of that in three-dimensional volumetric terms. And in fact, here is an installation view of the piece from downstairs at a similar moment. So actually what's happening is these sculptural forms are kind of slowly mutating. You're looking really at one thing. What I've given a cinematic explanation of the mechanism of the wipe. But when you look at this as a sculptural object in space, you're looking at one single mutating form, and you don't necessarily separate what you're seeing. It's just kind of a complex volume. And here, this is now looking away from the footprint toward the projector, and you get this big scalloped, that's the elliptical form, and I think this is the wave form. Here is the film, in fact, long film, You and I, Horizontal 2, is in 4 parts, two parts of 2 parts, and this is the reverse order of the one you've just seen, and again, we'll look at in time. Now, this is the moment at the end of the wipe, at the end of the transition, where our traveling wave has now reduced and reduced and reduced. It will end as a straight line. So you'll see it happening before your eyes, and just as the wipe finishes and the ellipse is gone, this will be restored to being a straight line. And of course, the motion of the wave traveling along gets quieter and quieter as there's less and less wave to move. And this is just to show you one other part of the piece. We've just seen the 2 halves of the ellipse with the traveling wave. Now there's also 2 halves which are with the ellipse and a straight line whose motion is dependent on an invisible wave. We imagine this straight line is floating on water. Imagine that. And there is literally underlying this, which you can't see it, is a wave which is determining the motion of this line. So now imagine yourself as an upright object in the room. This is quite vertiginous. This is quite destabilizing. It works on your sense of balance, and it moves. At this moment, it's in a way moving up your body. So this is just, these are stills that I made from the piece. You know, I don't know what the sampling is, it's probably once a minute or something like that. And you can see the top and the bottom, the outer lines represent the first 2 we looked at, with the ellipse and the traveling wave. And you can see, if you follow you can more or less follow the travelling waveform. It begins as a straight line in this one, first part, gradually turns into a deeper and deeper wave, gets to maximum in the middle, and then goes off to the other end. And here we do it in reverse. We begin with a deep travelling wave and end up the straight line. This pair in the middle are both floating straight line, floating line versions. That's U and I horizontal 2. This is a installation view of U and I horizontal 3, in which I made it a double projection, 2 side-by-side projections, both facing the same direction. And what's quite interesting about a double projection is that, whereas with the single, the one we just saw, half of what was going on was always concealed. It was hidden behind the other half of the wipe, right? So, but by having 2 parts, we saw it again, but it displaced. We did see everything, but not all at the same time. When you have double projection like this, you can have everything at once, albeit displaced spatially to the left or the right. And so it's still complex, and it still doesn't require, it's not necessary that you have to rush around trying to understand exactly what the structure is. But I think it's quite interesting that everything that there is to see is present at any moment. This, of course, is with a double work, have a more complex footprint. You can see the division down the middle between the two. So I've talked quite a bit about this business of turning your back on the footprint in order to see the volumetric form and vice versa. And I had been thinking for a while about the possibility of all changing that by how to reorganize the projection setup such a way you could see both at once. And this is a piece that I made the beginning of the year. It's called Face to Face. And for the first time, I didn't use the walls, but built very large floating translucent screens. And you can see from this image, you see a translucent screen means that you can read the footprint from the back or the front. What that means is that if you're standing where this camera is standing, you can see the volumetric form and the drawing that's producing it at the same moment. Or you can be inside to the side of the volumetric form or inside of it and look at the drawing that's producing it through the plane of light. Well, I should mention that this is also a double work, of course, 2 projectors facing the opposite direction and projecting onto screens. This is my paper maquette from the studio when I was working it out. So the flat ends are the screens. Projectors are on the floor in each case, and they're going in opposite directions. So to go back to that previous image, you're looking, we've got our back to the drawing producing this, but then we've got that drawing over there. And I was able to play around with the form in such a way that imagine you're inside to you're inside a volume. This volumetric form is curved on the left. And as you're in that cone, half a cone, you can begin to finally realize that the circle on the right-hand side on that screen is completing the form you're inside. So you can always be in a complete form, albeit it's a bit of a stretch because one of the forms is 3-dimensional and the other is graphic. But it's fact, and I was able to play with that. And here's another installation view that gives you sort of a glimpse of how you've got a back, you've got a front, you have two projected beams. This was at Sean Kelly Gallery in February, and actually the show that I have in Paris right now is a version of Face to Face, but using walls, but similar idea. Okay. when in the 70s, I did realize it'd be possible to actually project vertically, downwards from the ceiling onto the floor. I found that I did a lot of drawings of this. But I never did it because the trouble is with a film projector weighs about 70 pounds. It's got 2 reels, and it's rather gravity bound. And if you turn it through 90 degrees, the reels fall off, or the projector doesn't work. And it weighs a hell of a lot, and there's just no way to wedge it up there, you know. So, but once I was working again in the last 12 years, I was working with digital projectors, and they're just black plastic boxes. And they don't mind where they're put. And so I began to make vertical works, starting about 2004. And this was one, actually, where I was quite explicitly able to play with that idea that I told you about when I was looking at an early work and finding it was breathing. And I made 3 works, vertical works, all called Breath, 1, 2, and 3. They're the same height as they would have been had they been horizontal, so we're talking about 30 feet. And they form, of course, very interesting architectural pockets. You can sort of look at the footprint and the body of the piece at the same time. Sort of, I say, because looking down and looking up are actually very different, even though you can do it in one movement. You can't actually look at them all at the same time. What was going on was there was one single traveling wave moving through the frame. Inscribed into that was an ellipse, so the ellipse was contained by the wave, and the ellipse was breathing in and out like a lung. It was very, very unmistakably physical. Then I went on to make a double vertical, which was called Between You and I. Again, this idea that everything is present between the 2 forms, nothing is missing. Again, same wipe structure, same syntax. And, you know, for the first time there were quite architectural associations as well as sculptural ones. You know, you had the feeling that you would walk into a chamber. It was like a tent-like forms. And when apertures opened and closed, you did instinctively think of them as doorways some way. A strange thing happened. For the first time, I began referring to these as standing figures, which is sort of a sculptural expression. But that seemed extremely apt. So it muddled everything up and sort of thickened the mystery. So I was very aware that I was now, particularly the second time round, became very aware that I was working in a field which was sort of somewhere between sculpture and cinema, and I would say drawing. And 5 minutes of pure sculpture was the title I gave to my shirt, the Hamburger Bahnhof, which was 2011, I think. And that term I took by because there was a film I'd admired for a long time, or rather I should say a title I'd admired for a long time, by Henri Chaumet, who made a film in 1925 called 5 Minutes of Pure Cinema. And there's something I liked about the way it had duration built into its title and so on. Right? So I just took the second term for the title for my show in Berlin. But I always felt that the first term was nesting inside it. So this is an installation view of the exhibition in Hamburger Bahnhof. We were able to have 4 vertical works in the center and 3 horizontal at each end of the hall. And this, I put this picture here because I wanted to make a point that one of the other spaces this work seems to occupy is a social space. It's a very sociable, quiet sort of thing that goes on when people are in the room looking at them. They're usually looking quite quietly. There's a bit of murmuring going on. People are comfortably walking around one another. Everything is very slow. And I think, actually, this is quite significant, and it's connected, I think, to the pace at which the works move. For me, slowness is a virtue. That's because I found that when, if you make these works move too quickly, then what happens is that people standing there, they stop moving and they stay rooted to the spot and they start watching. And watching is what you do with a movie when your body's not needed. You slough off your body, you watch a movie with your eyes and your imagination. Watching is not what you do with sculpture. You go find sculpture, you have to go looking for it, and your body in motion is part of the experience of coming to know a three-dimensional form. And so to make the lines move quickly would be to defeat the object of the work. So I've always hewed to the principle that the fastest object in the installation should be the observer. And that sort of helped me determine the speed. And then another thing I'll say about motion and speed is that these works do appear to have a sort of emotional charge which people grasp immediately. And I think if these were projected slides that weren't moving, there wouldn't be an emotional charge that would last for more than a few seconds. You just use it up. So when people say, oh, the light is beautiful, I think it's actually not the light. I think it is the light, but it's the light embodied in duration. Light undergoing mutation and change, a structural change. As the structure, the important structure of these works happens in time. And I think that's really the key to what the work does when you look at it. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the solid light works now. I'm just going to finish by talking about some public projects, two in particular. One still a proposal and the other realized. You'll see it's an extension for me into the public sphere with works that don't require the dark and so on. So the first of these is this is a proposal for a work in New Zealand in the city of Auckland. I was asked to make a proposal for an industrial silo. The whole of the waterfront, like many waterfronts in many cities in the world, is changing. You know, the old industry is no longer there. There's old tanks and old factories lying around, and it's a mess. And then it gets redeveloped for mixed use or what have you. And they decided that they were going to tear down all the tanks and factories, and they would leave a few token industrial objects as a memory. And then it was one of these that they decided they would turn into a piece of art. So I was asked to make a proposal. It's right on the edge of the harbour of Auckland. Very beautiful deep water harbour. And what was interesting about its location for me was that it received direct sunshine all day long. This is the winter sun, the arc of the winter sun. And this is the arc of the summer sun. And the sun could always see it and shone on it directly, and there was quite a lot of sun. This was actually a work that I did in my studio in '73 before I made Line Describing a Cone. I was testing the idea of solid light. But it became the organizing principle for this, except, of course, that the beam of light in this particular silo was to be 30 feet tall. This was a watercolor I did in the '70s too, showing the way in which the beam of light coming in such a way, a plane of light is actually on the move the whole time, since the sun is moving around the sky. So the way I was going to do this is take the concrete silo, which had a thickness of a wall about this thick, and to make 4 cuts in it, vertical cuts, which would have like an archer's window. It flared outwards so that the sun would be able to come in from quite a wide angle, and thereby capture the sun on its passage across the sky all day long. And there's a technical diagram showing how this archer's window could capture quite a chunk of the arc of the sun. And interestingly, just because of the distances between the 4 cuts, 3 times a day you've got a double plane of light coming in. There'd be a haze machine in there, just like there's a haze machine downstairs in the gallery. which would make these planes of light palpable and visible. Well, self-explanatory. So this came as sort of call and response, night and day. And I think there are echoes of long film for ambient light in this piece, actually. So there's the arc of the projection. The projected light then goes through the same arc that the sun undertook in the other direction. So this is, it's very typical of public works, is that they go through long, some bureaucratic processes, and things happen or don't happen for reasons that are way beyond the realm of art. Politicians come and go, the economy changes, all those sort of things affect it. So I still don't know actually if this will be realized. We have our hopes. The next and final thing I'll talk about is the piece I have realized. It's on in the city of Hamburg right now in northern Germany, called Crossing the Elbe, which began in March, and consisted of 3 searchlight, very narrow, very focused searchlight beams that were crossing the city of Hamburg. Remarkable pencil slim beams that can go for 10 kilometers. They spread a little bit if it's very humid, but essentially they keep their form. Quite small. They were mounted on the tops of 3 buildings in Hamburg. These are the lamps. So this is an aerial view of Hamburg. Hamburg has an island in the middle of it called Wilhelmsburg. It's the largest island, second largest island after Manhattan, urban island. And up to now, it's been essentially an industrial area, again, changing rapidly. And the city of Hamburg is up in the north. But there's always been a tradition that this is sort of Greater Hamburg. And so we had a tall building in each of the 3 places with a lamp on each. And then I set about, we were initially the idea had been to have rotating lights, like very slow lighthouses. But that was vetoed by the harbour master, who said all his ships would be, all their pilots would be blinded and the ships would run into them. So on and so forth. So I came up with a different idea. That's another thing that happens with public works. Regulatory people come in and help. So I made a slightly different structure, which was I decided to change the angle of each lamp by 15, 20 degrees every week, so that over a 3-month period, the entire city, Greater Hamburg, will be visited by one or more of these lamps. So this was the calculation on the central one, which would be doing a 360-degree arc. And then there were 2. This is the southern one, so it's a 180-degree arc facing into Greater Hamburg. And then the northern one, 180-degree arc, also facing into the middle of Hamburg. So that was the schema, which then produced our weekly changes. So the changes will be done during the day, and the lights. So I should say also the lamps come on exactly 90 minutes after sunset each night, and they're on for only 21 minutes. So there's this brief moment, really. And the consequence of starting 90 minutes after sunset is that each day, the time it starts by the clock changes by a couple of minutes. So in the middle of the winter, the lights come on at around 6:30. In the middle of the summer, they come on at around 11 o'clock at night. So in terms of human time, experience time, things you're doing at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, there's a sort of shift that occurs through the year that the piece is up. Goes through the 4 seasons, repeats this process 4 times, but each time it's going to happen, each season it's going to happen different time of night. So I'll just show you a few aerial, these are drawings really, just give an idea of the reach. That's the old city of Hamburg with the lights, Wilhelmsburg in the middle, and can see, there's a sort of rotations within rotations that are occurring because of the way the changes in angle were calculated. I'm not going to go through the whole season, but I think that's about 6 months, 6 weeks we've done. And now I just want to finish by showing you a very short video clip of the piece, because what was quite interesting to me was this is actually, in terms of scale, it's a sort of spectacular thing, but it's actually an incredibly quiet work. And what began to interest me was that the only thing that doesn't move is the light. What the video brings out is the way that it's the city that's teeming around the work of art rather than the other way around. I rather like this. So I hope I can make this one work. Otherwise I'm going to have to paint a picture. Thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions. Who would like to start us off with a question for Anthony? Trisha, go ahead.
I could be so greedy to ask two.
I'm sorry?
If I could be so greedy to ask two.
Yeah.
First question is, you said that your work is always fundamentally about drawing or a drawing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your drawing practice. I noticed there are a lot of students here. I thought that would be interesting. And secondly, you had mentioned that in works like you rely horizontal too, and in many works made at that time, you have to turn your back when you're looking at the projection on the wall, the drawing on the wall, or the experience of the cone on the other side.
Yeah.
And then you said that you then developed this new project for Sean Kelly recently.
Yeah.
You see both.
Yeah.
Do you actually feel to a certain degree that the works like you and I, horizontal two, are not fully resolved because the viewer can't see both? I mean, I actually love that there's a switch back and forth.
Oh, yes.
Do you as an artist feel that it's not fully resolved for you, and that's why you push to move into?
No, I don't think that at all. No, I like all of them. It's really a question of coming up with new problems, and you know, I quite like to have a new problem when I'm working on a new work rather than just make another piece. And so I enjoy coming up with those problems that seem interesting to think about. Actually, what it...
Did you feel there was a problem for you, or at some point in time?
It's not a problem for me. It's really a problem for the forms. You know, the pleasure for me comes from finding problems, and then coming up with ways to approach them. And really, every work embodies some thoughts about the medium and about the form. And you know, this is my way of thinking about the work. Doesn't have to be anyone else's. And I don't think there are weaknesses. I mean, each work is questioning all the other works. I mean, they're all talking to one another. And I like very much the fact that you have. I mean, our bodies are flat. And I think what's so interesting about the business of turning around is that you're looking in the volumetric form. You've got a curved, you're half a cone to the side of you, let's say. So it's on your left. So you think, let's have a look and see how the drawing produces that. So you turn round. Great, well, there's a curved line on the wall, but now it's on your right. And I find personally it's a completely mind-bending thing where you try to accommodate this flat problem we have, and the left and the right. And so that becomes part of the dynamic of looking at works when that's going on. And you have another dynamic happening with face-to-face, which is trying to connect in your imagination a three-dimensional form you're in. At the same time, you can see the graphic other half, but only as a line drawing. That's even harder in a way, but it's an interesting problem. So that's what I would say about that. Drawing, yes, everything begins and ends with pencil for me. I mean, I work out. When I'm working out one of these pieces, of course, I have to work it out in two ways. It's on the one hand, it's a sculptural form. On the other hand, it's not at all. It's a line drawing, and so I have to go back and forth, doing three-dimensional renderings of what the form will look like in 3 dimensions, and then on the same time doing lots of storyboards tracing the progress of a line across a frame, and working out the mechanism for generating that, the changes of that line. And then going back again and then trying to draw what the sequence will look like in 3 dimensions. So that happens for a while. Then after that, I have to prepare instructions for my programmer, which take the form of what I call instruction drawings. Instruction drawings are basically very precise diagrams with a lot of measurements and notes about how long things take and the way that form turns into that form and so on. In effect, I write out verbal algorithms for the programmer to then execute as code. And then he gives me back the coded form, but it's a variable interface. We developed an interface that I could work with that would enable me to tell him, yes, I want a curved line that's 300 pixels tall, and I want it to take 60 seconds to move from the left of the frame to the right, things like that. So he'll do that, and that will be the default setting, but then there'll be a set of boxes where I can change those numbers. So the first thing I do when I get back a programmed piece is to play with it and see if there's anything I haven't thought of by trying to break the system. And that becomes quite a creative stage, actually, is to play with my own variables, which I couldn't do in my head, but you can do on the computer screen. And the great thing about digital arena is that I can project immediately, and I can actually see what it's like in 3 dimensions. So let's say I've arrived at the point where I'm pleased with the values. I decide it's done, I render the film out, it's finished. But then, when it's projected, then the drawing becomes a drawing again, at the very center of the sculptural object. I like that very much. It's a sort of loop, in a way.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead, Martin.
I'm really curious about 20 years off and how that affects your practice, to have all that. Were you thinking about art during that time and just not making privately, or what happened when you started that?
It's a good question. I knew someone would ask. Well, first of all, I did stop for 20 years. I did not make a single bit of art for 20 full years. However, I was still in the center of the art world. I was one of the problems at the end of the 70s, I was 30-something, was that I had no way to make a living and no possibility of making a living making this kind of work, since at that time it was not part, time-based work, installation work was not something the galleries handled. So I began a graphic design firm designing and editing art books, which I did for 20 years. I mean, fairly successfully. I had a studio of 5 people and so. One of the reasons that I'd it was easy to stop. I mean, I had to make a living, but it was because I'd felt I'd completed the series. But then what happened at the end of the 70s was when the work was shown in museums and Kunsthalls, particularly in Europe, I discovered that the work I'd made was invisible because it had been made in city lofts. It had been, all the avant-garde film show places were lofts. And what I discovered when I was showing in Kunsthalls in Europe was that lofts have a lot of dust in them, and that dust was the medium which made my work visible. Plus, lofts in the 70s always had artists with cigarettes in their hands. And that was also part of the way in which the work was made visible. So in the absence of that, in the middle of Sweden, for instance, very clean air, lovely new museums, just nothing between the projector and the wall, just a lovely drawing on the wall, nothing, absolutely zilch. And so I began to think that I'd made a sort of bad aesthetic error. I made a mistake, in a way. And I tried to solve the problem. There wasn't any way to solve it. We tried dry ice, we tried burning incense, we tried all kinds of things. But there was no real way to work to solve the problem of visibility, to create a kind of particulate in the air which was safe and which was acceptable. And then, so various things happened in the 90s. Of course, what happened is that if we take the period I wasn't making art, that was the very period in which we went from the printed page to the screen. The digital revolution gradually occurred during that period. In the come to the early 90s, video art had moved into the art world in a very decisive way, which became the Trojan horse for all kinds of other things following it that were time-based. And in the 90s also, thanks to the discotheque, the haze machine was invented. So those two things occurred in the 90s, and I was looking at that time at quite a lot of every other gallery was showing video art. And some of it was very good, and some of it was very, very unambitious. And so I began looking at that and feeling vaguely competitive. We're looking at the mid-90s now. And at a certain moment, some personal things happened in my own life, and I suddenly decided I had to stop doing what I was doing and go back to making art. And so I withdrew from the firm, leaving it with the people that worked for me, and went back to making art. And I was drawing for a couple of years, and I gradually eased into... And my first new piece was 2003, and of course by this time I was familiar with computers. So I had no sort of bump to get over between analog and between film and digital at all. It was a very smooth transition in a way, so that wasn't an issue. And so once I started again, I was roaring away, you know. And then I was very lucky because a number of historical exhibitions, which Kelly mentioned, started up around the same time I restarted up, which were enormously helpful for me because it gave a sort of context, historical context for the work I was doing. And I became, for a while, I think what was called a re-emerging artist.
I'm glad you're back.
Thank you.
You've been back a while.
Yeah, thank you.
We all are. Thank you, Anthony, so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.